Ladies and gentlemen, we need to step back from the immediate Cleveland Browns drama for a moment and address something that is brewing at the league level, something that has direct and serious implications for the future of Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland and for the broader organizational decisions that this franchise will be forced to confront heading into the 2027 NFL Draft. Because the conversation happening right now about Arch Manning and the Arizona Cardinals is not just an interesting side story about a famous quarterback family and a struggling franchise. It is a story that connects directly to everything we have been documenting throughout this entire offseason about the Cleveland Browns' relationship with their franchise quarterback and the organizational temptation to keep drafting quarterbacks regardless of whether the competitive situation actually demands it. So let us build this out completely and honestly, because the full picture is more significant than any single piece of it suggests in isolation. The Arizona Cardinals are underdogs in all 17 games on their 2026 schedule. Every single game. Not most of them. Not the road games against the toughest competition. All 17. And they are double-digit underdogs in 8 of those 17 matchups. They are even home underdogs against the Jets and the Raiders, which are not exactly teams that inspire terror in opposing fan bases when they show up at your stadium. The Cardinals are projected, by every available metric and market assessment, to be one of the worst football teams in the NFL during the 2026 season. Now, for those who cover football purely as a competitive sport, that is simply a story about a struggling franchise that has not yet assembled the talent necessary to compete at a high level in a demanding league. But for those paying attention to the broader landscape of NFL draft positioning and the specific quarterbacks available in the 2027 draft class, that record projection tells a very different and very consequential story. The Arizona Cardinals, if they perform anywhere near as badly as the odds suggest they will, are going to be in strong position to hold the first overall pick in the 2027 NFL Draft. And the player most prominently discussed in connection with that pick, the player whose name has been attached to the top of virtually every 2027 draft conversation since before the 2026 season has even begun, is Arch Manning. Let that connection sit with you for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything else in this conversation. Arch Manning is the nephew of Peyton Manning and Eli Manning. He is the heir to the most celebrated quarterback dynasty in NFL history. He is the player whose name recognition and family legacy generate the kind of cultural momentum that the NFL as a business entity, as a media and entertainment product that depends on compelling storylines and marquee names to drive ratings and engagement and merchandise sales, has every incentive to facilitate and celebrate. A Manning quarterback in the NFL is not just a football story. It is a cultural event. It is a generational narrative. It is the kind of story that the league's marketing infrastructure is built to amplify and that television partners are built to prioritize. And the question being raised, the question that a growing number of observers are asking with increasing directness and increasing urgency, is whether the NFL schedule construction process, which determines which teams face which opponents at which times and in which competitive contexts, was designed in a way that makes the Cardinals' path to the number 1 pick in 2027 more likely than pure competitive chance would produce. The Cardinals are underdogs in every game. Double-digit underdogs in nearly half of them. Is that purely the product of an honest assessment of their roster construction and their competitive capability relative to the teams they will face? Or does the schedule they were given, the specific opponents and the specific contexts of those matchups, reflect some level of design that serves the league's interest in positioning a specific franchise for a specific draft outcome? These are serious questions. They deserve to be asked seriously. And the fact that they are being asked with increasing frequency and increasing urgency by people who follow this league closely reflects a level of institutional skepticism about the NFL's competitive integrity that goes beyond casual conspiracy theory into something that deserves genuine analytical engagement. Now let us connect this directly to Shedeur Sanders and the Cleveland Browns, because that connection is the most important reason this story deserves attention in the context of everything we have been covering throughout this offseason. We have already documented the concern that if the Cleveland Browns fail to commit fully and permanently to Shedeur Sanders as their franchise quarterback, if they allow the organizational dysfunction and the ownership-level interference and the narrative management that has characterized this entire offseason to ultimately produce a Watson-first outcome that relegates Sanders to a backup role or undermines his development enough to make his departure from Cleveland look inevitable, the organization will be in position to justify going back into the draft for another quarterback. And if the 2027 draft produces the scenario that the Arizona Cardinals' schedule projection suggests it might, that quarterback could be Arch Manning. Think about what that means for the Sanders situation in the most direct possible terms. If Cleveland starts Watson over a clearly superior Sanders in the 2026 season and the results reflect that poor decision-making with a losing record that positions the franchise in the upper portion of the 2027 draft order, the organizational temptation to use the draft position to select Arch Manning would be enormous. Not just for football reasons, though a Manning quarterback with elite family pedigree and the developmental support of his famous uncles would attract genuine organizational interest on football grounds alone. But for the financial and marketing and cultural reasons that drive so many NFL organizational decisions that get dressed up as purely football-based evaluations. A Manning quarterback in Cleveland would sell tickets. It would drive media interest. It would generate the kind of national attention that a market like Cleveland struggles to command consistently without a marquee narrative attached to its most important position. The business case for drafting Arch Manning in the first round of the 2027 draft, if Cleveland is positioned to do so, would be overwhelming to the kind of ownership mentality that has been visible throughout this entire offseason in its relationship with the quarterback position. And that is precisely why the warning that has been issued repeatedly throughout this story, the warning that if Cleveland drafts a first-round quarterback in 2027, Shedeur Sanders will almost certainly want out, needs to be understood with even greater urgency in the context of what the Arch Manning landscape is beginning to look like. Because this is not a hypothetical future quarterback who might or might not emerge as a compelling enough prospect to justify the investment. This is Arch Manning. This is a name that carries cultural weight and family legacy and media narrative power that no other prospect in recent memory has brought into a draft class. If he is available in the first round of 2027 and Cleveland has the pick to select him, the organizational temptation will be at a level that no amount of loyalty to Shedeur Sanders or honest assessment of what Sanders has produced will be sufficient to overcome if the foundation of commitment to Sanders has not been firmly and permanently established long before that moment arrives. This is the scenario that Sanders fans need to be paying attention to right now, in the summer before the 2026 season even begins, because the decisions being made in Cleveland today are the decisions that will determine whether the organization's relationship with their franchise quarterback is strong enough to resist that temptation when it arrives in its most compelling and most culturally powerful form. If Cleveland commits to Sanders fully and completely, if the 2026 season produces the kind of performance and the kind of results that reflect what a fully supported and genuinely committed franchise quarterback can accomplish with the offensive infrastructure that has been assembled around him, then the conversation about Arch Manning in 2027 becomes irrelevant to the Cleveland Browns planning process. You do not draft a first-round quarterback when your current first-round quarterback is winning games and developing into the player the organization invested in building around. The math does not support it. The football logic does not support it. The organizational credibility with the player you would be replacing does not survive it. But if the 2026 season unfolds the way the worst-case scenario for Sanders' organizational situation suggests it might, if Watson gets the starting nod despite the preseason evidence pointing towards Sanders as the superior option, if the organizational dysfunction that has characterized this offseason continues into the competitive season in ways that prevent Sanders from expressing his full capabilities, if the results reflect poor organizational decision-making rather than the genuine competitive ceiling of the quarterback being evaluated, then Cleveland could find itself in exactly the position that makes the Arch Manning conversation not just tempting but organizationally irresistible. And at that point, everything documented throughout this entire offseason, every first-team rep at minicamp, every helmet camera session, every organizational statement about expecting Sanders to have more command of the offense, every draft pick invested in building the offensive infrastructure around his success, all of it becomes the tragic setup for an organizational betrayal of the most preventable kind. The Manning family is watching this unfold. They are watching the Cardinals' schedule. They are watching the draft positioning landscape. And whether or not the NFL schedule construction reflected any deliberate design to facilitate a specific outcome, the competitive reality is that Arizona is positioned to be historically bad in 2026 in ways that make their 2027 draft position potentially extraordinary. Skip Bayless addressed the Arch Manning situation on his show, adding another national media voice to a conversation that is growing in volume and in significance as the 2026 season approaches. When national figures are discussing the Manning draft positioning landscape with the kind of analytical seriousness that Bayless brings to his coverage, it signals that this is no longer a fringe conversation happening in the margins of football discourse. It is a mainstream discussion about one of the most significant quarterback storylines of the next several years. Carson Beck is also part of the Arizona picture, with reports suggesting he could get some starts for the Cardinals during the 2026 season while the franchise manages toward the draft positioning that makes the Manning selection possible in 2027. That is a franchise that has made peace with losing in the short term in exchange for the possibility of transformative gain in the medium term, and the clarity of that organizational strategy stands in interesting contrast to the organizational confusion and contradictory messaging that has characterized Cleveland's handling of the most important position on its own football team. Arizona knows what it is doing and why. Cleveland, based on everything that has been documented throughout this offseason, is still fighting internal battles about something that should have been settled long before the summer of 2026. The message for Cleveland is simple and urgent. Commit to Shedeur Sanders now. Commit fully, finally, and without the ambiguity and the ownership-level interference and the narrative management that has made the commitment feel conditional and contingent throughout this entire process. Name him the starter, build around his success, give him the organizational unity and the coaching support and the full professional respect that his performance has earned and that the draft class investment has been designed to facilitate. Do that, and the Arch Manning conversation in 2027 is irrelevant to Cleveland's future because the franchise already has its answer at the position and is committed to maximizing that answer rather than perpetually searching for something shinier. Fail to do that, and the Arch Manning scenario becomes the most dangerous organizational temptation the Cleveland Browns ownership group will have faced in years, arriving at the moment of maximum vulnerability for a franchise quarterback who deserved better than what he has been given throughout this entire saga. The choice belongs to Cleveland. The window to make the right one is narrowing with every day that passes without the clarity and the commitment that this situation demands. Shedeur Sanders is still working. Still preparing. Still giving this organization every reason to choose correctly. The question is whether Cleveland will. And the Arch Manning shadow hanging over the 2027 draft landscape is the most powerful argument yet for why the choice cannot be delayed any longer. Shake the haters off. The stakes just got higher. And the time to get this right is running out.